Scarcely 2 hours after the ink dried on my final divorce decree, my former husband's entire toxic family rolled up to my $4 million Atlanta estate with 8 matching Louis Vuitton suitcases in tow. They stood on my sweeping front porch with arrogant, condescending smirks, fully convinced they had just successfully stolen my magnificent home right out from under me. They genuinely thought I was a defeated, broken, and humiliated woman. But the very second I pulled open that custom mahogany front door and politely stepped aside to let them in, their unearned confidence was about to be completely and utterly shattered. What was waiting for them inside the walls of my house would completely destroy their lives forever. My name is Maya, and I am 34 years old. Before I dive deeper into this incredible story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to this channel if you have ever had to stand your ground against a toxic, manipulative family who tried to tear you down. Trust me, you are going to want to hear exactly how I handled the ultimate betrayal. The ink on my divorce papers was still practically wet. It was a suffocatingly humid Tuesday afternoon in Atlanta, and I had just driven back from the downtown courthouse. For the first time in 5 exhausting years, I was finally free from the heavy anchor that was Darius. I walked slowly through the grand foyer of the home I had purchased entirely with the massive profits from my medical supply logistics company. When Darius and I first crossed paths, he smoothly claimed to be a brilliant, forward-thinking startup consultant. In grim reality, he was a professional grifter and the ultimate mama's boy, constantly draining my hard-earned accounts for his completely useless cryptocurrency ventures and fabricated investment schemes. But today was supposed to be the absolute, definitive end of that nightmare. I was standing in my massive gourmet kitchen, pouring a generous glass of expensive red wine, ready to celebrate my hard-won freedom. I had built my empire from the dirt up. I grew up on the rough south side of Chicago, raised by a fierce single mother who taught me the priceless value of relentless, back-breaking hard work. I had fought tooth and nail to secure massive, highly lucrative government contracts for medical procurement. I was a completely self-made millionaire by the time I hit 30. Darius, on the other hand, was raised by a deeply delusional mother who convinced him he was God's greatest gift to the universe simply for inhaling oxygen. My rare moment of well-deserved peace was violently interrupted by a furious, rhythmic pounding on my front door. It was not a polite, neighborly knock. It was the heavy, aggressive, entitled banging of someone who fully believed they owned the property. I calmly placed my wine glass on the cool marble island counter. My bare feet echoed softly against the imported hardwood floor as I walked toward the entrance. I did not even bother peering through the peephole. I already knew exactly who was making that obnoxious noise. I unlocked the deadbolt, pulled open the heavy double doors, and there they were. Standing on my pristine front porch was my ex-mother-in-law, Veronica. Standing right next to her was her carbon copy daughter, Jade, and Jade's intensely arrogant, smugly privileged white husband, Chad. Surrounding them on my porch like a barricade of unearned wealth were 8 giant Louis Vuitton suitcases. Veronica was wearing her Sunday best, a ridiculous, overly flashy floral pantsuit that she had absolutely bought using my credit card late last year without my permission. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, and her chin was tilted up in that familiar, sickening pose of absolute disdain she always reserved exclusively for me. Jade was aggressively scrolling on her smartphone, chewing gum and loudly rolling her eyes as if waiting a mere 10 seconds for me to open the door was the greatest human rights violation she had ever suffered in her entire privileged life. Chad stood slightly behind the 2 women, arrogantly jingling the keys to his leased BMW, looking at the luxurious facade of my house with the greedy, calculating, hungry eyes of a desperate man, already planning how to spend a commission he had not earned. "Well," Veronica snapped, her voice cutting through the heavy Georgia humidity like a rusty, jagged blade. "Are you going to stand there blocking the entrance all day? Or are you going to pack your cheap little bags and get off my son's property?" I leaned against the door frame deliberately slow, crossing my arms defensively but comfortably. I let a calm, utterly relaxed, almost pitying smile spread across my face. "I am sorry, Veronica," I said, keeping my voice dangerously quiet and composed. "I must have misheard you. Did you just say your son's property?" Veronica scoffed loudly, waving a freshly manicured hand mere inches from my face. Oh, please, Maya, do not play dumb with me right now. We all know exactly what happened in that courtroom this morning. Darius called me the very second the papers were officially signed. He told us exactly how the asset division played out. He got the house. He finally got what he deserves after putting up with your cold, ungrateful, selfish attitude for 5 miserable years. Jade finally looked up from her phone's screen, snapping her chewing gum with a loud, obnoxious pop. Yeah, Maya, the free ride is officially over. You might be some big-shot CEO at your little medical supply warehouse, but you do not know how to treat a real man. Darius said you practically rolled over in court today and handed him the deed without a single fight. Honestly, it is the absolute least you could do after keeping him trapped in this marriage while holding him back from his true potential. Now hurry up and move your things out of the way. Chad and I are officially claiming the master suite. I stared at Jade, letting the sheer, unadulterated audacity of her words wash over me. This was a spoiled woman who had not held a steady, paying job since she was 22 years old. She spent her empty days pretending to be a wealthy lifestyle influencer on social media while living in a cramped apartment that I had secretly paid the rent for twice when Chad lost his job in the finance sector. And here she was, standing proudly on my porch, verbally claiming the master bedroom that I had meticulously designed, paid for, and built with my own blood, sweat, and tears. The sheer entitlement was almost impressive. But I did not yell. I did not scream. I did not give them the chaotic, emotional reaction they were so desperately craving. They wanted me to lose my temper. They wanted me to become the angry, aggressive stereotype so Chad could pull out his phone, record me, and so Veronica could play the helpless, bullied victim just like she always did at her Sunday church group. Chad stepped forward smoothly, putting a reassuring, overly dramatic hand on Jade's shoulder. "Come on, Maya. Let us be reasonable here," he said, using that calm, condescending corporate tone he always utilized when he wanted to sound intellectually superior to me. I work in high-level finance, so I understand how complicated asset division can be for someone who just runs a blue-collar warehouse. But the law in the state of Georgia is very crystal clear. Darius is the legal owner of this entire estate as of 10:00 this morning. We really do not want to make a messy scene in a prestigious neighborhood like this. The wealthy neighbors across the street are already looking at us. You do not want to be escorted out of here in metal handcuffs in front of the local country club members, do you? Just go upstairs, pack your things quietly, and we will do you a massive favor and not press criminal charges for you lingering on the property. I shifted my gaze directly to Chad. I was genuinely amazed by his sheer, blinding ignorance and casual disrespect. He had just referred to my nationwide, multi-million-dollar logistics empire as a simple warehouse. He was actively patronizing me on the front steps of my own home, the home I had paid pure cash for before his deadbeat brother-in-law even figured out how to file a basic tax return. My mind quickly flashed back to all those agonizing Sunday dinners where Veronica would serve Darius the biggest portions of food, relentlessly praising his imaginary business deals while turning to ask me if my little delivery service was making enough money to cover his luxury car lease payments. They were parasites, every single one of them, and now the parasites had boldly marched up to the front door to consume the host entirely. Veronica took another highly aggressive step forward, trying her absolute hardest to physically intimidate me. "Listen to me very carefully," she hissed, dropping the fake, polite Christian act entirely. "You never belonged in this upper-class family." I told Darius from the very beginning that a hood girl from the south side of Chicago would never be able to handle our elite standard of living. You thought your little government contracts made you special. You thought because you had a little bit of money, you could control my son and disrespect our prestigious family name. But Darius is brilliant. He is a financial genius, and he finally outsmarted you. He secured this $4 million estate for our family to properly enjoy. So I am going to tell you one last time. Go upstairs, grab whatever cheap clothes you brought into this marriage, and leave before things get terribly ugly. I looked down at the 8 oversized designer suitcases lined up perfectly on the concrete. I looked at Veronica's triumphant, hateful, flushed face, absolutely glowing with the thrill of her perceived victory. I felt a genuine, deep wave of pity for how completely and utterly clueless they all were. They truly believed they had won the war. They thought Darius had orchestrated the greatest real estate heist of the century behind my back. They thought I was surrendering the massive house because I was weak, exhausted, and defeated. They had absolutely no idea that I had willingly, happily handed Darius the deed to this massive house this morning because it was no longer a valuable asset. It was a carefully laid, highly radioactive trap. I did not raise my voice a single decibel. I simply uncrossed my arms, took a deliberate, slow step back into the grand hallway, and pulled the heavy custom door wide open. I gestured toward the grand, sunlit foyer with a polite, highly welcoming sweep of my hand. "You know what, Veronica? You are absolutely right," I said smoothly, keeping my tone perfectly conversational and pleasant. "The judge did award this house to Darius this morning. The paperwork is officially finalized and filed, so please come on in. It is all yours now. But I really hope you do not mind a bit of a crowd. I fear the living room is a little cramped at the moment." Veronica smirked widely, completely missing the dark, lethal warning hidden deep in my voice. She confidently grabbed the handle of her oversized suitcase and marched right past me like a victorious queen entering her newly conquered castle, with Jade and Chad trailing eagerly right behind her. They stepped confidently into the foyer, ready to claim their grand prize. But their arrogant, greedy smiles vanished the very second they saw exactly who was waiting for them inside. Veronica had barely crossed the threshold into my grand foyer when I shifted my weight, planting myself firmly in the center of the wide archway that led to the main living areas of the house. I blocked their path entirely. The foyer was massive, featuring a sweeping double staircase and imported Italian marble floors that echoed loudly with the heavy thud of their matching Louis Vuitton luggage. But to get to the rest of the house, the master suite, the kitchen, or the living room, they had to go through me. Veronica stopped abruptly, her suitcase wheels squeaking in loud protest. She let out a sharp, exaggerated sigh of frustration. Jade rolled her eyes again, crossing her arms and tapping her expensive designer heel against my marble floor. But before either of the dramatic women could launch into another tirade about how quickly I needed to pack my things, Chad stepped forward. Chad was the kind of mediocre man who believed his mere presence commanded absolute authority. He was a mid-level manager at a boutique financial firm, a job he had secured entirely through his wealthy father's golf connections rather than his own basic competence. He wore a tailored navy suit that was slightly too tight around the shoulders, and he had a terrible habit of speaking to me in a slow, measured tone, as if he were explaining a very simple concept to a very slow toddler. Throughout my entire marriage to Darius, Chad had consistently relied on subtle racial and gender microaggressions to try and put me in my place. He could never handle the harsh fact that a black woman from the south side of Chicago was making 10 times his annual salary, living in a house he could never dream of affording, and running a massive business he could not even comprehend. Chad held up his hands in a fake placating gesture, palms facing outward, stepping in front of Veronica as if he were a trained negotiator stepping into a dangerous hostage situation. "Let us all just take a deep breath," Chad said, using his smooth, heavily practiced corporate mediator voice. "Maya, I know emotions are running incredibly high right now. Divorce is a difficult, painful transition, especially for a woman who has to come to terms with losing a luxury lifestyle she has unfortunately grown accustomed to. But we need to keep things completely civil. We do not need any unnecessary hostility." I stared at him, my expression completely unreadable and blank. The sheer audacity of this man standing in the foyer of the house I bought, telling me to calm down and process the loss of my lifestyle, was almost intoxicatingly funny. Chad took another step closer, lowering his voice into a deeply patronizing register. "Look, I am going to speak to you as a fellow business professional. You did well for yourself with your little logistics company. You really did. It is highly commendable considering your rough background. But real estate law, specifically high net worth asset division in the state of Georgia, is an entirely different beast. It is highly complex, and I do not expect you to fully grasp the legal mechanisms at play here. The bottom line is that the title transfer was legally executed this morning. Darius is the sole legal owner of this property. You have absolutely no legal right to stand in that archway and block us from entering our family home." He paused clearly, waiting for me to argue with him. He desperately wanted me to raise my voice. He wanted me to. Snap! It was the classic, predictable trap. If I showed even a fraction of the anger I was perfectly entitled to feel, he would instantly weaponize it against me. He would eagerly label me as the angry, irrational, aggressive black woman, a toxic narrative he and Veronica had been quietly pushing for years. When I remained perfectly silent, simply watching him like a hawk, Chad adjusted his silk tie and decided to push harder. He pulled out his smartphone and tapped the screen, making absolutely sure I saw the device securely in his hand. "Maya, I am trying to help you preserve whatever tiny shred of dignity you have left," Chad continued, his tone shifting from patronizing to openly threatening. "We are in a highly exclusive, private gated community. The wealthy people in this neighborhood value peace and quiet. The HOA president lives 2 doors down. I happen to play golf with the precinct police commander for this district at the country club. If you refuse to step aside, if you force me to make a phone call, the police are going to arrive very quickly." Jade chimed in from behind him, her voice dripping with venomous spite. "Exactly. Just move, Maya. You are completely embarrassing yourself." Chad nodded, emboldened by his wife's support. "When the police arrive, they are going to look at the legal paperwork, and they are going to see a hostile trespasser refusing to vacate a $4 million estate. You do not want to be another criminal statistic, Maya. You do not want the neighbors to pull out their phones and record you being dragged out of this beautiful neighborhood in metal handcuffs. Think about your business. Think about how bad a public arrest record would look for your brand when you are trying to secure those government contracts you care so much about. Do not make me ruin your life over a petty temper tantrum. Just step aside." I listened intently to every single word he said. I mentally cataloged every subtle insult, every racial undertone, every arrogant, baseless assumption. I thought about the time just 2 years ago when Chad had secretly come to my private office, practically crying and begging me for a $70,000 personal loan to cover a terrible options trade he had illegally made with his firm's money. I had written him the massive check to save Jade from total bankruptcy, and he had never paid me a single dime back. I thought about how he always made sure to order the most expensive vintage scotch at dinner, knowing Darius would silently pass the massive bill to me. He truly believed he was the smartest person in the room. He believed his skin color, his gender, and his mediocre finance degree gave him absolute, unquestionable authority over me and my property. He thought he was brilliantly backing me into a corner with the threat of the local police. He had absolutely no idea that the real authorities were already here, standing just 20 feet away in my living room, quietly and meticulously cataloging overwhelming evidence of massive federal crimes. The silence in the foyer stretched on, thick and heavy. Veronica shifted her weight impatiently, glaring at me with pure hatred. Jade impatiently tapped her phone screen. Chad stood incredibly tall, his chest puffed out, waiting for my inevitable, tearful surrender. He thought he had completely outmaneuvered me. Slowly, I let a dark smile touch the corners of my mouth. It was not a warm smile. It was the exact kind of smile an apex predator gives right before the steel trap snaps completely shut. I saw a brief flicker of deep confusion cross Chad's eyes. This was not the reaction he had calculated in his head. He expected tears or shouting or desperate begging. He did not expect me to look entirely amused and in control. "Chad," I said, my voice soft, smooth, and dangerously calm. "I really appreciate you taking the time to explain Georgia property law to me. It is incredibly generous of you to worry about my professional reputation and my brand. And you are absolutely right. This is a very exclusive neighborhood, and we certainly would not want to cause a loud scene that might involve law enforcement. That would be a terrible look for everyone involved." I took a deliberate step backward, pulling my shoulder away from the archway. I reached out and firmly grasped the heavy brass handles of the custom double doors that separated the foyer from the massive, sunken living room. I looked at Veronica, who was already gripping her Louis Vuitton handle with eager anticipation. I looked at Jade, who was smirking at what she thought was my pathetic defeat. And finally, I looked directly into Chad's arrogant blue eyes. "I would never want to stand in the way of the law," I told them, my voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged space. "You came all this way to claim your grand prize. You packed your bags. You brought the whole family. It would be highly rude of me to keep you waiting in the hallway any longer." I pushed the heavy double doors up. The hinges gliding silently, revealing the expansive, brightly lit living room beyond. I stepped completely out of their way and gestured gracefully toward the interior of the house. "Come in," I said, my smile widening into something sharp and unforgiving. "It is your house now, though I am afraid the living room might be a little crowded today." Veronica marched aggressively past me with her chin held high, radiating absolute triumph. Her heavy suitcase rolled across the imported marble, the wheels clicking loudly as she led her little parade into the main living area. Jade was right on her heels, practically skipping with excitement at the thought of claiming a mansion she had not paid a single dime for. Chad brought up the rear, his chest still puffed out with that unearned confidence, ready to step into the role of the wealthy lord of the manor. They descended the 2 short steps into my massive sunken living room, fully expecting to find an empty, pristine space, ready for them to conquer and decorate. Instead, they walked straight into a massive federal occupation. The living room was the absolute crown jewel of the property. It featured 20-foot-high ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the perfectly manicured grounds, and a breathtaking custom crystal chandelier that hung suspended like frozen rain in the center of the room. But today, the luxurious warmth of the space had been completely erased. It was replaced by the cold, sterile, and terrifyingly quiet efficiency of the United States federal government. Scattered across the expensive Persian rugs and the custom velvet sofas were 6 people in sharp, dark suits. They were not moving like casual movers. They were moving with the meticulous, highly coordinated precision of a tactical military unit. Hanging heavily from silver lanyards around their necks were large, undeniable metal badges. The bold blue and yellow seal of the FBI gleamed under the bright light of the chandelier, right alongside the imposing gold shields of the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Veronica froze instantly. Her freshly manicured hand slipped from the handle of her Louis Vuitton bag, and the heavy suitcase tipped over, hitting the hardwood floor with a loud, hollow thud. Jade crashed right into her mother's back, letting out a sharp gasp as she finally looked up from her smartphone. The gum she had been aggressively chewing just seconds ago went completely still in her mouth. Her eyes widened to the size of large saucers as she stared at a woman in a dark windbreaker who was currently using bright red, tamper-proof evidence tape to seal shut Darius' massive desktop computer. But it was Chad whose reaction was the most satisfying to watch. Chad worked in a boutique financial firm. He had spent his entire adult life surrounded by strict compliance officers and federal banking regulations. The exact moment he stepped into the room and saw the letters IRS printed in bold white across the back of an agent's tactical jacket, all the blood completely drained from his perfectly tanned face. His broad shoulders collapsed. The arrogant posture he had used to threaten me on the front porch evaporated into thin air. He knew exactly what this was. He knew this was not a simple misunderstanding or a routine tax audit. You do not send 6 federal agents to a $4 million estate on a Tuesday afternoon unless someone is going to federal prison for a very long time. I stood quietly at the top of the stairs, casually leaning against the archway, simply observing the absolute destruction of their reality. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by the sharp, terrifying sound of packing tape being ripped from a dispenser. Agents wearing blue latex gloves were methodically emptying every single drawer of the massive mahogany desk I had purchased for Darius for his 30th birthday. They were pulling out massive stacks of files, offshore bank statements, and leather-bound ledgers, dropping them unceremoniously into heavy cardboard banker boxes. Another agent was taking high-resolution photographs of a hidden wall safe that had already been drilled open and completely emptied. Watching Darius's family stand there, completely paralyzed, I could not help but think about all the times they had sat in this exact room and viciously mocked me. For years, Veronica would recline on my expensive furniture, sipping wine paid for by my business, and loudly proclaim to anyone who would listen that her son was an absolute investment genius. She would wave her hand dismissively whenever someone asked about my medical logistics company, calling it a stressful, blue-collar delivery job. She firmly believed that Darius was the true brains of the family. He was the visionary. He was a financial prodigy who was destined for Wall Street greatness, held back only by a wife who refused to fund his brilliant ideas. Jade had always eagerly echoed that same delusion. she would consta. And tly compare my steady, grueling 7-day work weeks to Darius' flashy lifestyle. He wore tailored suits, drove leased luxury cars, and threw around investing buzzwords he barely understood. They all bought into the illusion completely. They worshipped the ground he walked on. They believed that his sudden ability to secure massive loans and launch new shell companies over the past 2 years was solid proof of his unmatched intellect. But where was the genius now? When the walls finally started closing in, when the federal government started asking serious questions about millions of dollars in fraudulent loans, the visionary did not step up to protect his family. He did not call his mother to warn her. He did not tell his sister to stay away from the blast radius. He simply packed a single bag, cleared out whatever cash he could easily access, and vanished like a complete coward in the middle of the night. He left his own mother standing in the living room holding the bag, entirely clueless about the lethal trap she had just walked into. One of the agents, a tall, broad-shouldered man with sharp features and a completely exhausted expression, finally paused his work. He had been carefully cataloging a stack of burner phones they had pulled from Darius' private office. He dropped a phone into a clear plastic evidence bag, sealed it, and slowly looked up. His eyes scanned the 3 intruders standing paralyzed at the entrance of the living room. He looked at Veronica in her ridiculous floral pantsuit. He looked at Jade, who was shaking visibly. He looked at Chad, who looked like he was about to pass out on my floor. And then the agent looked down at the 8 massive, overstuffed Louis Vuitton suitcases sitting directly at their feet. The air in the room grew instantly heavy. The agent did not smile. He did not offer a polite greeting. He just stared at the luggage with the cold, calculating eyes of a man who had just caught 3 accomplices walking straight into an active crime scene carrying exactly what he was looking for. I stayed perfectly still, maintaining my calm demeanor. I had warned them. I had told them the living room was crowded. I had given them every opportunity to turn around and walk away. But their immense greed, their arrogance, and their desperate need to see me defeated had blinded them completely. They had marched right past the glaring warning signs because they believed they were legally untouchable. Veronica finally found her voice. It was not the loud, booming, authoritative tone she had used on the front porch. It was a high-pitched, trembling squeak. She took a tiny, hesitant step backward, her eyes darting frantically between the agents and the boxes of evidence. "What?" she stammered, clutching her designer handbag tightly against her chest. "What is going on here? Who are you people? What are you doing in my son's house?" The tall agent slowly placed the evidence bag on the table. He reached into his suit jacket, pulled out a notepad, and took a slow, deliberate step toward them. "Are you Veronica?" he asked, his voice low and incredibly firm. Veronica nodded weakly, completely stripped of her usual arrogance. "Yes, I am Darius's mother. I demand to know what is going on here right now." The agent did not blink. He just pulled a pen from his pocket and clicked it. The sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet room. Then he turned his attention to the terrified man standing right behind her. The tall agent looked right past Veronica's floral pantsuit and locked his sharp eyes directly onto Chad. "And who exactly are you two?" the agent asked, gesturing with his heavy silver pen toward Chad and Jade. Jade swallowed hard, the loud popping of her chewing gum completely silenced. Her previous sense of absolute entitlement vanished into thin air, replaced by the instinctual panic of someone who knew they were standing entirely too close to a roaring fire. "I am his sister, Jade," she managed to squeak out, her voice barely registering above a terrified whisper. She nervously gestured to the man beside her. "And this is my husband, Chad." Chad gave a stiff, incredibly jerky nod. He was sweating profusely now. A bead of perspiration was slowly tracing its way down his perfectly groomed temple. The confident, condescending finance manager, who had just threatened me with the local police on my own front porch, was suddenly trembling under the heavy, silent gaze of a single federal investigator. From my vantage point, slightly elevated on the top step of the living room landing, the entire scene unfolded like a perfectly orchestrated, incredibly satisfying theatrical performance. The camera of my memory was pulling back, capturing the wide, chaotic reality of the moment. I had a full, completely unobstructed view of their collective panic, framed perfectly by the 20-foot-high windows and the agents methodically tearing apart Darius' fake life in the background. Veronica, however, was not quite ready to surrender her delusion. She had spent the entire morning celebrating her son's supposed legal victory over me. She had packed her bags with eager anticipation, dreaming of the lavish country club life she was about to inherit. She simply could not process the harsh, unforgiving reality standing right in front of her. She took a deep, shaking breath, puffed out her chest, and tried to summon the exact same indignant, upper-middle-class authority she regularly used to terrorize customer service workers and bank tellers. "Listen to me very carefully, young man," Veronica said, pointing a shaking manicured finger directly at the federal agent. "I do not care what kind of fake badges you bought online or what kind of sick prank my ex-daughter-in-law put you up to. You have absolutely no legal right to be in this house. My son Darius just won this entire estate in a high-profile divorce settlement this very morning. He is the sole legal owner of this property. We have the court-stamped paperwork sitting right outside in the car. This is a private gated residence, and you are officially trespassing on our family property. I demand that you leave right now before I call the real authorities." The agent stopped writing. He slowly lowered his notepad and stared at Veronica with an expression of pure, unadulterated professional pity. It was the exact kind of look an adult gives a small child who is throwing a tantrum over something completely ridiculous and entirely out of their control. He did not flinch. He did not raise his voice. "Ma'am," the agent said, his voice flat, exhausted, and completely devoid of any emotion. "I am Special Agent Vance with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The individuals working behind me are special agents with the Internal Revenue Service Criminal Investigation Division. We are not actors. We are not trespassing. We are currently executing a federal search and seizure warrant, which was signed by a United States District Judge at exactly 6:00 this morning." Veronica's jaw practically unhinged, dropping wide open, but she quickly snapped it shut. Her stubborn pride simply refused to let her back down, even when staring directly into the face of federal law enforcement. "A warrant for what?" she demanded, her voice growing shrill and aggressively defensive. "Darius is an honest, hard-working investment consultant. He is a financial genius. He would never do anything to warrant a federal raid. If anyone in this house is doing something illegal, it is her." Veronica whipped her head around and pointed an accusing finger directly at me. I was still standing casually on the steps, my arms resting loosely at my sides, watching the beautiful chaos unfold without a single ounce of fear. "She is the one you should be investigating," Veronica yelled, her face turning an ugly, blotchy shade of red. "She runs some shady medical supply business out of a warehouse. She is probably stealing government money and forging contracts. Darius is an innocent man. He is a legitimate corporate strategist." Agent Vance did not even bother turning his head to look in my direction. He kept his steely eyes locked firmly on Veronica's panicked face. "Your son is not a corporate strategist, ma'am," Agent Vance replied smoothly, his tone cutting through her lies like a hot knife through butter. "Your son is currently the primary target of a massive federal criminal investigation. We have substantial, irrefutable evidence proving that over the last 24 months, Darius engineered a highly sophisticated scheme to defraud the federal government. He applied for and successfully received over $3 million in Paycheck Protection Program loans utilizing a complex network of completely fabricated shell companies that possessed absolutely zero actual employees." Jade let out a loud, dramatic gasp, her hands flying up to cover her mouth as she stumbled against her designer luggage. Veronica physically recoiled as if she had been struck across the face by an invisible hand, her back hitting the edge of a custom velvet armchair I had imported from Italy. "That is a lie," Veronica shrieked, her denial absolute and desperate. "Darius makes brilliant investments. He trades cryptocurrency. He buys commercial real estate. He bought this $4 million house." "He did not buy this house," Agent Vance corrected her, his tone growing sharper and significantly less patient. "He fraudulently used this exact property as collateral to secure even more illegal high-interest loans, attempting to launder the stolen federal funds through various offshore accounts before the audit caught up to him. The house you are currently standing in is now officially considered the proceeds of wire fraud and money laundering. As of this exact moment, this entire estate, along with everything inside it, has been seized by the United States government. Whatever divorce paperwork your son showed you this morning is completely and utterly worthless. The sheer crushing weight of the agent's words hit the room like an anvil dropping from the ceiling. The grand, luxurious mansion they had strutted into just moments ago with their heads held high was no longer their promised castle. It was an active federal crime scene, and the United States government was their new, unforgiving landlord. For a few seconds, the only sound in the room was the heavy breathing of Veronica and the continued rustling of the IRS agents systematically boxing up Darius' fraudulent life. But Chad could not handle the silence. Chad was a man who had built his entire identity on the unwavering belief that he was always the smartest guy in the room. He worked in finance. He wore tailored suits. He knew all the right banking terminology. His incredibly fragile ego simply could not accept the fact that his idiot brother-in-law had somehow brought the FBI straight to their doorstep. Chad desperately needed to regain control of the narrative. He needed to prove to his wife, to his mother-in-law, and most importantly to me, that he was not intimidated by a badge. Chad suddenly stepped out from behind Veronica, aggressively adjusting the lapels of his suit jacket to try and make himself look broader. He forced a dry, deeply arrogant chuckle, shaking his head slowly back and forth as if he were dealing with a group of incompetent interns at his boutique accounting firm rather than armed federal agents. "Okay, let us just hold on a second here," Chad said, projecting his voice across the room, injecting his tone with that familiar, patronizing corporate swagger he used to belittle me. "I work in high-level finance. I deal with senior compliance officers and strict federal banking regulations every single day of my life. I know exactly how these audits work. What you guys have here is clearly just a massive accounting error." Agent Vance slowly turned his gaze away from a hyperventilating Veronica and focused entirely on Chad. Chad took another step forward, feeling foolishly emboldened by the sound of his own voice echoing in the large room. "Darius might have been a little aggressive with his tax structuring, sure," Chad continued smoothly, waving a dismissive hand. "Sometimes entrepreneurial ventures and fast-moving startups get flagged by automated algorithms. It happens all the time. But to call it a sophisticated wire fraud scheme is completely ridiculous. You agents just do not understand how complex investment portfolios and rapid capital transfers operate in the modern market. You are looking at perfectly legitimate corporate movements and completely misinterpreting them because you lack the financial literacy. I guarantee you, if I sit down with your lead forensic accountant for 10 minutes, I can clear up this entire misunderstanding. You guys are wasting your time terrifying my family and wasting taxpayer money." Agent Vance stared at Chad for a long, heavy, incredibly tense moment. The agent did not argue. He did not raise his voice to defend his intelligence. He simply looked down at his leather-bound notepad, scanning a specific line of text, and then looked back up at Chad's perfectly tanned, insufferably arrogant face. "You are Chad Tinsley?" the agent asked, his voice suddenly dropping an octave, becoming dead serious. Chad smirked clearly, believing his superior financial intellect had just successfully intimidated a federal investigator into backing down. "Yes, I am," Chad replied proudly, puffing out his chest and standing a little taller. Agent Vance slowly closed his notepad and slid it safely into the inside pocket of his dark suit jacket. He took one step closer to Chad. "Perfect," the agent said, his eyes turning cold, calculating, and absolutely uncompromising. "We were just about to come find you." Chad took a sharp, stumbling step backward, colliding hard with Jade's shoulder. All the color had completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in his expensive tailored suit. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some kind of slick corporate excuse, but no words came out. He knew exactly what Agent Vance meant. In the financial sector, when the federal government tells you they were just about to come find you, your career, your reputation, and your freedom are already gone. Jade let out a quiet, terrified whimper, shrinking behind her husband as the absolute reality of their situation finally began to sink in. But Veronica was not looking at the federal agents anymore. As the heavy silence stretched across the room, her eyes darted away from Agent Vance and locked directly onto me. She saw me standing casually on the steps. She saw my relaxed posture. She saw the glass of expensive red wine resting on the marble counter just behind me. And most importantly, she saw the calm, radiant, completely unbothered smile resting perfectly on my face. For the first time in her life, Veronica finally put the pieces together. The gears in her mind furiously round against each other until she arrived at the horrifying truth. "You knew," Veronica whispered, her voice shaking violently as she pointed a trembling finger in my direction. "You knew they were coming." I did not break eye contact. I slowly descended the 2 short steps into the sunken living room, moving with the effortless grace of a woman who had just successfully amputated a diseased limb. I walked right past the IRS agent sealing a box of offshore bank statements and stopped a few feet away from my former mother-in-law. "I did not just know they were coming, Veronica," I said, keeping my voice smooth, steady, and loud enough for the entire room to hear. "I was the one who practically rolled out the red carpet for them." Veronica gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically struck. "You see," I continued, pacing slowly across the expensive Persian rug. Darius genuinely believed he was a criminal mastermind. He thought because he watched a few cryptocurrency podcasts and learned how to register an anonymous LLC online, he could outsmart the federal government. But what Darius entirely forgot is that my medical logistics company secures multi-million-dollar contracts with federal hospitals. I am subjected to rigorous, invasive, and relentless financial audits every single quarter. When you operate at my high level, you develop a very sharp eye for accounting irregularities. I paused, letting my gaze drift over to Chad, who was visibly shaking, before looking back at Veronica. "About 6 months ago, I noticed some very strange, unexplained transfers moving through our joint accounts," I explained calmly. "Money was bleeding out of my legitimate accounts and being funneled into dummy corporations Darius had set up in Delaware. So I quietly hired a private forensic accountant to dig into his independent ventures. It took my investigator exactly 3 weeks to uncover the Paycheck Protection Program loan fraud, the fabricated employee payrolls, and the forged signatures. But worst of all, my accountant discovered that Darius had fraudulently listed this exact $4 million estate as the primary collateral to secure his illegal federal loans." Jade let out a loud sob, finally realizing the magnitude of the disaster. She sank down onto one of her designer suitcases, burying her face in her hands. "When my lawyers found out the house was tied to a federal crime, they panicked," I said, a genuine smile spreading across my face as I recalled the memory. "They told me I needed to fight tooth and nail in the divorce settlement to force the sale of the property, to liquidate the asset before the government caught wind of the fraud. But I told them absolutely not." Veronica stared at me, her eyes wide with a mixture of absolute horror and dawning comprehension. "If I fought for this house, if my name remained on that deed for even 1 second longer than necessary, the federal government would have had the legal right to freeze my assets," I explained, spelling it out for them as if I were teaching a kindergarten class. "They could have seized my company. They could have frozen my payroll. They could have dragged my spotless reputation down into the mud right alongside your idiot son. I needed to cut off my legal liability immediately and permanently." I took 1 step closer to Veronica, leaning in slightly so she could not escape my gaze. "So, I went into that courtroom this morning and I played my part perfectly," I whispered, though my voice carried easily in the quiet room. "I sat there and played the role of the exhausted, defeated, emotionally broken wife. I instructed my legal team to surrender completely. I gladly, willingly, and intentionally signed 100% of the ownership of this radioactive property over to Darius. I gave him the house. I gave him the debt. I gave him the federal indictment. I severed myself from his sinking ship, and I let him tie the heavy anchor directly around his own neck." The silence that followed my confession was absolute. Even the federal agents had stopped shuffling papers, quietly listening to the surgical precision with which I had dismantled Darius' life. Veronica's face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. The sheer humiliation of realizing she had been celebrating a trap broke whatever fragile grip she had left on reality. "You manipulative bitch!" Veronica screamed, her voice cracking as she lunged forward. Agent Vance immediately stepped between us, holding up a massive authoritative hand that forced her to stop dead in her tracks. But she kept screaming, spitting her words at me over the agent's shoulder. "You set him up. You trapped my son. You knew he was in trouble and you threw him to the wolves. You are a cold, heartless snake, Maya. You never loved him. You just wanted to destroy him because he is a better businessman than you will ever be." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice to match her hysterical screaming. I just stood there and let her exhaust herself. When she finally ran out of breath, chest heaving, eyes wild with panic, I delivered the reality check she had been avoiding for 5 long years. "Do you remember Thanksgiving last year, Veronica?" I asked, my voice cutting cleanly through the tension in the room. Veronica blinked, completely thrown off guard by the sudden shift in topic. She glared at me, refusing to answer. "You sat at the head of my custom dining table," I continued, my tone dripping with absolute ice. "You ate the expensive organic turkey that I paid for. You drank the imported wine that I bought. And you looked directly across the table at me, right in front of the entire extended family, and you said, 'Darius is a visionary. Darius is a financial genius. Darius operates on a level of intelligence that someone like you could simply never comprehend.'" I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting the silence build before delivering the final blow. "Well, Veronica, if your son is such a brilliant visionary, if he is such an absolute genius, I want you to look around this room right now and answer one very simple question." I gestured broadly to the federal agents, the seized evidence boxes, and the bright red tape plastered across the doors. "Where is he?" Veronica stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. "If Darius is a genius, why did he run away to the Mexican border in the middle of the night?" I asked, my voice growing harder with every single word. "Why did he flee the country like a coward? Why did he call you this morning, knowing this house was actively being targeted by the federal government, and tell you to pack your bags and move in? He did not win this house for you, Veronica. He used you as a human shield. He abandoned his own mother, his sister, and his brother-in-law, and left you all standing directly in the blast radius so he could save his own skin." Veronica's knees finally gave out. The sheer, undeniable truth of my words hit her like a physical blow. She collapsed onto the hardwood floor right next to her overturned Louis Vuitton suitcase, burying her face in her hands as she finally began to weep. It was not her usual manipulative, theatrical crying. It was the deep, ugly, soul-crushing sobs of a woman who had just realized her golden child had willingly sacrificed her to the federal government. I looked down at her shaking form, feeling absolutely nothing. No pity, no regret, just the cold, incredibly satisfying warmth of total vindication. But the show was not over yet. Darius had not just sacrificed his mother. He had sacrificed his arrogant brother-in-law, too. And Agent Vance was just getting started. I slowly turned my back on Veronica, leaving her to weep miserably on the hardwood floor. I walked calmly toward the kitchen island. I reached out and wrapped my fingers around the delicate crystal stem of my wine glass. I lifted it to my lips, taking a slow, deep sip of the expensive Cabernet. The rich, bold flavor grounded me in the moment. I leaned against the cool marble counter and redirected my attention to the center of the room, ready for the next act of the tragedy. Agent Vance had completely ignored Veronica's dramatic collapse. His cold, unwavering gaze was locked entirely on Chad. Chad was standing absolutely perfectly still, looking like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was simply waiting for gravity to pull him down. His perfectly tailored navy suit suddenly looked like a straitjacket. "You see, Mr. Tinsley," Agent Vance began, his voice taking on the sharp clinical tone of an auditor who had already found the missing money. "Committing federal loan fraud requires a surprising amount of upfront capital. To convince the United States government that you possess a legitimate company with a massive monthly payroll, you actually have to show a history of payroll distribution. You have to cycle real money through real bank accounts to create a digital paper trail. Fake companies require real seed money to get off the ground." Chad swallowed hard. The sound was incredibly loud in the quiet room. He unbuttoned his suit jacket with a trembling hand, desperately trying to get more air into his lungs. "Darius did not have that kind of clean capital," Agent Vance continued, taking another slow step toward Chad. "His personal accounts were chronically overdrawn. His legitimate credit was practically non-existent. He needed an injection of roughly $400,000 to establish the initial payroll history for his shell companies. He needed a silent partner who had access to massive amounts of liquid capital and the authority to move it without immediately triggering compliance alarms." Agent Vance reached into his suit jacket and pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a bank wire transfer confirmation. He held it up so Chad could see the bold black numbers printed across the page. We followed the initial funding for Darius' fraudulent shell company. Ease backward through a maze of offshore accounts, Agent Vance stated smoothly. It was a decent attempt at money laundering, but completely amateurish by our standards. We traced the $400,000 directly back to a corporate escrow account managed by your boutique financial firm, and the signature authorizing the transfer of those client funds belonged to a senior portfolio manager named Chad Tinsley. Chad physically staggered backward. His shoulders slumped forward, and all the arrogant, superior posture he had carried onto my front porch vanished instantly. He looked small, terrified, and incredibly foolish. I did not know, Chad stammered, his voice cracking violently. I swear to God, I did not know what he was doing. He told me it was a short-term bridge loan for a commercial real estate development in Buckhead. He showed me architectural blueprints. He showed me forged zoning permits. He promised me a 30% return on the investment in less than 90 days. You bypassed your firm's internal compliance department. Agent Vance fired back, his voice rising in volume and authority. You used your senior executive clearance to wire $400,000 of protected client funds to a completely unvetted limited liability company. You did not perform a single shred of due diligence because Darius promised you a massive kickback under the table. I watched Chad's face crumple. The delicious irony of the situation was almost overwhelming. Just 10 minutes ago, this exact same man had stood on my porch and lectured me about my lack of financial literacy. He had condescendingly told me that I did not understand how complex capital transfers operated in the modern market. He had treated me like an uneducated warehouse worker. And yet, this brilliant, highly educated finance manager had been completely outsmarted and manipulated by my deadbeat ex-husband. Darius had played him like a cheap violin. You are a licensed financial fiduciary, Mr. Tinsley, Agent Vance said coldly. You did not just facilitate the theft of government money. You embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars from your own clients to bankroll a criminal enterprise. That makes you a direct accessory to federal wire fraud. Chad's knees finally buckled. He reached out and grabbed the back of a custom velvet sofa to stop himself from hitting the floor. He was hyperventilating now, taking short, ragged, gasping breaths. He desperately yanked at his expensive silk tie, trying to loosen the collar of his shirt as a full-blown panic attack seized his chest. He realized in that exact moment that his life was completely over. His Series 7 license would be permanently revoked. His reputation in the financial sector was destroyed. He was going to federal prison, and he was going to lose absolutely everything. But the absolute best part of the entire spectacle was not Chad's collapse. It was the reaction of his loving wife. Jade had been sitting on her Louis Vuitton suitcase, quietly crying into her hands since she realized the house was being seized. But the moment she heard Agent Vance confirm that Chad had illegally given Darius the money, her head snapped up. Her tears vanished instantly, replaced by a look of absolute venomous fury. She did not rush over to comfort her husband. She did not wrap her arms around him and tell him they would fight this together. Instead, she stood up and marched directly toward him, her fists clenched tightly at her sides. You gave him the money, Jade screamed, her voice echoing shrilly off the high ceilings. You took money from your firm and you gave it to Darius. Chad looked at his wife with wide, terrified eyes. I was trying to help us, Jade, he pleaded, holding his hands up defensively. Your brother said it was a guaranteed return. He said we would double our money in 3 months. You are the one who kept complaining about our apartment. You are the one who kept saying we deserve to live in a mansion just like Maya. I did this to give you the lifestyle you wanted. Jade let out a furious, animalistic shriek. She lunged forward and shoved Chad hard in the chest. Chad stumbled backward, completely caught off guard by her physical aggression. You are an idiot, Jade yelled, shoving him again. You are supposed to be a senior financial manager. You have a master's degree in economics, and you let my deadbeat brother talk you into stealing from your own clients. Darius could barely pass high school algebra, and he somehow managed to con you out of $400,000. I was trying to secure our future. Chad yelled back, finally finding a shred of anger beneath his terror. He lied to me. He forged the documents. Your entire family is a bunch of pathological liars. You ruined my life. I ruined your life, Jade screamed, her face red and distorted with rage. Do you have any idea what this is going to do to me? My friends are going to see this on the news. My accounts are going to be frozen. I am going to have to sell my bags. I am Goy. And G to be married to a convicted felon. I should never have married a weak, pathetic loser like you. They stood in the middle of my beautifully decorated living room, screaming terrible, hateful things at each other, while the federal agents continued boxing up evidence all around them. Veronica was still weeping loudly on the floor, rocking back and forth, completely ignoring the vicious fight breaking out between her daughter and her son-in-law. I stood quietly at the kitchen counter, taking another sip of my wine. I watched the spectacular implosion of their toxic family dynamic. For 5 years, they had united perfectly under one shared goal. They had bonded over their mutual hatred and jealousy of me. They had constantly reinforced each other's delusions of superiority. They believed their last name, their skin color, and their fake social status made them better than me. But the moment the illusion was shattered, the moment the federal government ripped away their fake wealth and exposed the ugly truth, their loyalty to each other evaporated instantly. They turned on each other like starving wolves locked in a cage. There was no love in that family. There was only greed, manipulation, and conditional alliances based entirely on whoever had the most money at any given time. Chad was desperately trying to calm Jade down, begging her to keep her voice down before she gave the agents any more evidence. Jade was slapping his hands away, demanding he call a lawyer and fix the mess he had created. Agent Vance watched them bicker for a few moments, his expression completely unreadable. Then he let out a heavy sigh, clearly annoyed by the domestic dispute interrupting his crime scene. He turned away from the fighting couple and signaled to 2 of the agents standing near the front door. The agents stopped what they were doing and walked briskly over to the pile of designer luggage sitting in the foyer, the luggage that Veronica, Jade, and Chad had so proudly carried into my home just a few minutes earlier. It was time for the next layer of Darius' brilliant plan to be exposed, and this one was going to seal their fate entirely. The 2 agents did not hesitate. They stepped right past Chad and Jade, completely ignoring the bitter, venomous glaring passing between the married couple. The agents walked directly toward the grand foyer, where the barricade of brown and gold monogrammed canvas sat waiting. The 8 heavy Louis Vuitton suitcases were lined up perfectly against the imported marble wall, looking absurdly out of place inside an active federal raid. The moment the first agent reached out and placed his latex-gloved hand on the leather handle of the largest suitcase, Veronica snapped out of her hysterical crying fit. She scrambled up from the hardwood floor, her expensive floral pantsuit now wrinkled and covered in dust. "Wait!" she shrieked, her voice echoing sharply against the high ceilings. "What are you doing? Get your hands off my things!" Veronica threw herself between the federal agents and the luggage, spreading her arms wide as if she were a mother bear protecting her cubs. "Those bags belong to me," she demanded, her chest heaving as she tried to summon back that arrogant upper-middle-class authority she had used on my front porch. "They are my personal property. You have absolutely no right to search them." Agent Vance slowly walked over to the foyer, his heavy footsteps clicking deliberately on the marble. He stopped just a few feet away from Veronica. "Ma'am, I strongly suggest you step away from the luggage," he ordered, his voice dangerously calm. "I will do no such thing," Veronica fired back, her panic making her incredibly reckless. "Those suitcases contain my private wardrobe. They have my undergarments, my expensive dresses, and my personal jewelry. It is completely inappropriate and illegal for a group of men to dig through a woman's intimate belongings without a specific warrant. I am calling my lawyer right now." Agent Vance did not even blink. He did not pull out his phone or offer to wait for her imaginary lawyer. "The federal search warrant signed by the judge this morning encompasses this entire address," Agent Vance explained, slowly treating her with the exact same condescension she usually reserved for me. "It also explicitly covers any and all closed containers, vehicles, or locked bags located within the boundaries of the property. That includes the 8 oversized suitcases you voluntarily transported across the threshold of my active crime scene." Veronica opened her mouth to argue, but the agent standing next to her did not wait for her permission. He reached out, grabbed Veronica by the elbow, and firmly but gently guided her out of the way. She gasped in absolute outrage, but she did not dare strike a federal officer. The second agent knelt down on the marble floor and grabbed the heavy brass zippers of the largest suitcase. Veronica watched in absolute horror, her hand trembling uncontrollably. Even Chad and Jade had stopped their vicious fighting, turning around to watch the scene unfold with terrified fascination. The agent pulled the zippers smoothly around the track and flipped the heavy canvas lid completely open. There were no expensive silk dresses inside. There were no designer shoes or carefully folded undergarments. The thin, pathetic layer of cashmere sweaters Darius had placed at the very top of the bag was nothing but a terrible, incredibly lazy disguise. Beneath the sweaters, the massive suitcase was packed to the absolute brim with contraband. Neatly stacked in tight shrink-wrapped bundles were bricks of crisp $100 bills. The green paper practically glowed against the dark lining of the designer bag. But the cash was not the most damning evidence hidden inside. Scattered meticulously among the stacks of money were dozens of sleek black rectangular devices. They looked like oversized USB thumb drives wrapped tightly in anti-static plastic. I stood perfectly still by the kitchen counter, taking a slow sip of my wine as I looked at the open bag. I knew exactly what those black devices were. Over the last year of our marriage, I had watched Darius obsessively research them late at night when he thought I was asleep. They were cold storage hardware wallets. They were heavily encrypted physical drives designed to hold massive amounts of untraceable cryptocurrency, completely off the grid, away from the prying eyes of banking regulators. Agent Vance reached into the suitcase. He picked up one of the heavy bundles of cash, weighing it in his hand, and then picked up one of the cold storage wallets. He turned around and looked directly at Veronica. "You pack incredibly heavy for a simple move across town, Veronica," Agent Vance said, his tone dripping with absolute sarcasm. "Tell me, do you usually bring $250,000 in undeclared cash and a dozen encrypted crypto wallets when you relocate?" All the blood completely rushed out of Veronica's face. Her jaw dropped open and she stared at the stacks of money as if they were venomous snakes ready to strike. "I did not pack those," Veronica stammered, her voice dropping to a panicked, breathless whisper. She violently shook her head back and forth. "I swear to you, I have never seen that money before in my entire life. I do not know what those black things are." Agent Vance raised a skeptical eyebrow. "You just fought tooth and nail to protect this bag. You explicitly told me your undergarments were inside it." "Darius gave them to me," Veronica cried out, her self-preservation instincts finally completely overriding her maternal loyalty. "He brought those bags to my house late last night. He told me he was getting a head start on packing up his office. He told me to just load them into Chad's car and bring them straight here the second the court hearing was finished. He told me not to open them because the locks were broken." The absolute brilliance and the sheer unforgiving cruelty of Darius's escape plan finally clicked into place for everyone in the room. I could not help but let out a short, dark laugh. Darius knew the federal government was closing in on him. He knew his bank accounts were about to be frozen, and he knew this $4 million house was already lost. He needed to extract the stolen millions he had laundered, but he knew his name was already on a federal watch list. He could never risk walking through airport security or driving across the international border with millions of dollars in cash and hardware wallets in his own trunk. If he got pulled over for a simple broken taillight, his life was over. So, he did what he always did. He used his family. He had turned his own mother, his fiercely loyal sister, and his arrogant brother-in-law into unwitting drug mules for his stolen federal assets. He had manipulated their greed and their intense desire to humiliate me, tricking them into transporting the physical evidence of his massive fraud directly out of his hands and into their own. "Oh my God," Chad whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. He stumbled forward, staring at the open suitcase with wide, unblinking eyes. "He used us. He made us transport the stolen funds." Chad was a finance manager. He knew exactly what the law said. He knew that ignorance was not a valid legal defense when you were caught physically moving the proceeds of a federal crime. By driving those 8 suitcases across town to my house, Chad had officially committed felony conspiracy to launder money. Darius had tied the noose, and Chad had happily placed his own head right inside it. Jade let out a piercing, hysterical scream. She grabbed her own hair, pulling at it violently as she backed away from the luggage. "We are going to prison," she shrieked, looking wildly at her mother. "He set us up. Your precious golden boy set us up to take the fall." Veronica could not speak. He simply stared at the money, her entire world completely and utterly shattered. The son she had worshipped, the son she had elevated above everyone else, had purposefully handed her a loaded gun and told her to point it at her own head. Agent Vance dropped the bundle of cash back into the Louis Vuitton suitcase. He pulled off his latex gloves with a sharp snap that echoed through the quiet foyer. "Congratulations," Agent Vance said, looking at the 3 terrified, broken people standing before him. "You just hand-delivered over $200,000 in stolen federal cash, and what I can only assume is several million dollars in illicit cryptocurrency directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I suggest you all find very good defense attorneys because right now, you are the only ones left holding the bag." The tension in the room was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The arrogant, wealthy family that had marched up my front steps just 30 minutes ago was completely decimated. But the universe was not quite done punishing them yet, because right at that exact moment, from deep inside the pocket of Veronica's wrinkled floral pantsuit, a cell phone began to ring. The cheerful, upbeat marimba ringtone echoed sharply off the imported marble walls of the grand foyer. It was a ridiculously happy sound that cut through the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of the federal raid like a sudden crack of thunder. Everyone in the room instantly froze. The 2 IRS agents who had been cataloging the stacks of hidden cash stopped moving. Chad clamped his hands over his ears as if the noise physically hurt him. Jade let out a quiet, terrified whimper, backing away until her shoulders hit the wall. All eyes slowly turned toward Veronica. She was still on her knees on the floor, surrounded by the open Louis Vuitton suitcases and the exposed bricks of $100 bills. The ringing was coming directly from the deep pocket of her wrinkled floral pantsuit. She looked down at her own pocket with wide, unblinking eyes, acting as if there was a live explosive device vibrating against her hip. She was completely paralyzed by fear, her chest heaving as the phone continued to ring. "Answer it," Agent Vance commanded. His voice was not loud, but it carried an undeniable, terrifying authority that left absolutely no room for negotiation. Veronica swallowed hard. Her hands were shaking so violently that it took her 3 attempts just to reach into her pocket. She finally managed to pull the sleek smartphone out. The bright screen illuminated her pale, terrified face. The caller ID simply read, "Unknown caller." But every single person in that room, from the federal agents to the weeping sister-in-law, knew exactly who was on the other end of. What to do next? "Where are you, Darius?" Jade suddenly screamed, unable to contain her panic any longer. She pushed herself away from the wall, glaring at the phone in my hand. "You told us you were going to a weekend business conference in Miami. Why are you calling from an unknown number?" Darius went dead silent for 2 full seconds. He clearly had not expected his sister to be standing right next to the phone. "Jade." "Listen, everything is fine," Darius said quickly, his voice stammering slightly as he tried to regain control of his web of lies. "There was a slight change of plans. I had an urgent investment opportunity pop up down south. I'm driving through Texas right now. I should be near the border by midnight. I'm going to be laying low in Mexico for a few weeks to finalize a massive real estate deal. Just trust me. Everything is under control. Everything is under control." Veronica shrieked, her sorrow instantly igniting into a blazing, hysterical fury. She scrambled to her feet, leaning aggressively toward the phone in my hand as if she could physically reach through the speaker and strangle her son. "You lying, cowardly monster. Nothing is under control. Mom, calm down. What are you talking about?" Darius demanded, his fake confidence beginning to fracture. "You set us up." Veronica screamed at the top of her lungs, her face turning an ugly shade of purple. "You used me. You used your own mother to carry your dirty money. You gave me those bags and you sent me right into a trap. How could you do this to us? How could you abandon your family like this?" Veronica's screams were so loud the phone actually vibrated in my palm. "What trap?" Darius yelled back, the background wind noise on the call getting louder as he seemingly pressed his foot harder onto the gas pedal. "Mom, you're not making any sense. Who else is in the house with you? Where is Maya?" I looked at the phone, feeling the absolute power of the moment resting right in the palm of my hand. I slowly lifted my head and looked directly at Agent Vance. I gave him a slight nod, offering him the floor. Agent Vance took a deliberate step forward. He leaned his tall frame toward the phone, bringing his mouth just inches away from the microphone. "Darius Tinsley," Agent Vance stated, his voice completely devoid of any emotion, striking with the cold, unforgiving precision of a steel hammer. "This is Special Agent Vance with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." There was a sharp, audible gasp from the other end of the line. The sound of Darius breathing suddenly became incredibly rapid and shallow. I am currently standing in the foyer of the property you attempted to use as collateral in a multi-million-dollar federal loan fraud scheme, Agent Vance continued smoothly. I am standing here with a team of IRS criminal investigators. We have secured your property. We have secured the hundreds of forged documents and ledgers you left behind in your office. And thanks to the exceptionally cooperative efforts of your mother, your sister, and your brother-in-law, we have also secured the 8 suitcases containing over $200,000 in stolen federal cash and multiple encrypted hardware wallets. Darius did not say a single word. Only the sound of the roaring highway wind came through the speaker. Your assets are frozen, Darius, Agent Vance said, his tone dropping an octave. Your bank accounts no longer exist. Your passport has been completely flagged by federal authorities. You are currently driving a vehicle toward an international border that you will not be allowed to cross. I strongly advise you to pull over immediately, dial local law enforcement, and turn yourself in before the situation gets significantly worse for you. The foyer was dead silent. Veronica, Jade, and Chad were all holding their breath, staring desperately at the phone in my hand. They were waiting for Darius to say something. They were waiting for the golden child to offer an explanation, to apologize, to tell the federal agent that his family had absolutely nothing to do with his crimes. They were waiting for the man they had worshipped for 36 years to finally step up and protect them. But Darius was not a protector. Darius was a parasite. And when a parasite realizes the host is dead, it simply detaches and runs. There was no apology. There was no confession to clear his mother's name. There was absolutely nothing but the cold, calculating silence of a coward calculating his own survival. A sharp, distinct click echoed from the phone's speaker, and then the call disconnected. The screen in my hand went black, returning to the lock screen. The silence that followed was heavier and more suffocating than anything that had come before it. Darius had hung up. He had officially, permanently abandoned his family. He left his mother, his sister, and his brother-in-law standing in the middle of a federal raid, holding $250,000 in stolen cash, completely. At the mercy of the United States government, Veronica stared at the black screen of the phone in my hand. Her lower lip trembled violently. The realization that her son cared more about his own freedom than he cared about her life finally shattered the last remaining pieces of her arrogant facade. She let out a long, hollow wail of pure agony and collapsed back onto the marble floor, completely defeated. I looked down at her, then calmly locked the phone and placed it gently on the entryway table. I took another sip of my wine, savoring the taste of absolute, unquestionable victory. The master plan was finally complete, but before the police escorts arrived, there was still one final piece of business I needed to address. The house was seized, yes, but the land it sat on was an entirely different story. But before I could even bring up the matter of the estate grounds, a frantic, pathetic noise drew my entire attention away from the weeping woman on the floor. It was the sound of someone aggressively stabbing their fingers against a glass screen. I looked over and saw Chad. He had retreated into the corner of the grand foyer, pressing his back flat against the imported wallpaper as if he were trying to merge with the architecture and disappear completely. His perfectly tailored navy suit was now drenched in sweat, clinging awkwardly to his shoulders. His expensive silk tie was yanked entirely askew. He was holding his cell phone with both hands, his thumbs flying across the screen with desperate, trembling urgency. He was breathing in short, shallow gasps, sounding like a man drowning on dry land. Agent Vance watched him with absolute indifference, making no move to stop him. The federal agents already had everything they needed. Chad was completely free to make whatever phone calls he wanted, because there was absolutely no one left on Earth who could save him. I watched a genuine look of pure, unadulterated terror wash over Chad's face as he lifted the phone to his ear. He paced in a tight, frantic circle, running his free hand through his perfectly styled hair, ruining the expensive cut. "Pick up! Pick up! Pick up!" Chad muttered under his breath, his eyes darting wildly around the room, looking at the IRS agents as if they were executioners preparing a guillotine. Finally, the call connected. Chad let out a massive sigh of relief, instantly trying to forcefully lower his voice and artificially inject it with that familiar, arrogant corporate swagger he always used. But his voice cracked terribly, betraying his absolute panic. "Robert, thank God," Chad said, his words spilling out in a desperate rush. "Listen to me, Robert. I have a massive emergency on my hands. I am currently at my brother-in-law's house, and there has been a terrible misunderstanding with a federal audit. The FBI is here. I need you to send the firm's senior legal counsel down to this address right now. I need the corporate defense team." The foyer was incredibly quiet, save for the muffled sounds of the agents boxing up evidence in the living room. Because of the dead silence, and because Chad had the volume on his phone turned all the way up, I could hear every single word coming from the earpiece. The voice on the other end of the line did not belong to a concerned boss. It was a voice made of absolute, unforgiving ice. It was the voice of a senior managing director protecting his multi-million-dollar financial institution from a sudden catastrophic liability. "Chad," the voice of Robert crackled through the phone speaker, striking the air like a physical blow. "What in the world makes you think you still have the right to call this office?" Chad stopped pacing immediately. His expensive leather shoes squeaked to a halt on the marble floor. He blinked clearly, struggling to comprehend the hostility radiating from his boss. "Robert, what are you talking about?" Chad asked, his voice trembling again. "I am your senior portfolio manager. I need corporate legal representation to clear up this compliance issue." "There is no compliance issue, Chad," Robert fired back, his tone dripping with absolute disgust. "There is a massive, coordinated federal criminal investigation, and you are entirely at the center of it. The FBI raided our internal compliance department 2 hours ago. They walked in here with federal warrants and seized all of your digital files, your hard drives, and your client ledgers." Chad physically staggered backward, his shoulder hitting the wall hard. He opened his mouth, but absolutely no sound came out. "They showed me the wire transfers, Chad," Robert continued, his voice rising in volume, echoing faintly into my foyer. "You bypassed 3 levels of internal security to funnel $400,000 of protected client escrow funds directly into a fraudulent shell company. You breached your fiduciary duty. You stole from the clients who trusted this firm." "Robert, I can explain everything," Chad begged, his voice dropping an octave into a pathetic, desperate whine. "I was tricked. My brother-in-law showed me forged documents. He lied to me about the returns. I never meant to defraud the firm. You have to believe me, Robert. I have made this company millions of dollars over the last 5 years. You cannot just abandon me." "I am not abandoning you, Chad," Robert stated coldly. "I am terminating you. You are officially fired from this institution effective immediately. You are terminated for gross misconduct, embezzlement, and a direct violation of federal securities law. Human Resources has already processed the paperwork, and Building Security is currently packing your personal belongings into a cardboard box." Chad let out a sharp, breathless gasp. The absolute foundation of his arrogant upper-middle-class identity was being systematically dismantled right in front of him. But his former boss was not finished yet. "Furthermore," Robert added, his voice completely devoid of any sympathy, "the firm's legal team is not coming to help you. Our corporate lawyers are currently sitting in a conference room with the federal investigators, actively handing over every single piece of evidence they need to prosecute you. We are cooperating fully with the United States government to ensure you take the absolute maximum penalty for this betrayal." "No," Chad whispered, tears finally spilling over his perfectly tanned cheeks. "Please, Robert, you cannot do this." "I already did," Robert replied. "Oh, and Chad, per federal regulations, our compliance officers have officially contacted the Financial Industry Regulatory Authority. Your Series 7 license is suspended pending a formal revocation hearing. You are permanently banned from the financial sector. You will never trade, manage, or oversee another dime of investment capital as long as you live. Furthermore, our legal team has successfully filed an emergency injunction. Your personal bank accounts, your stock portfolios, and your retirement funds are completely frozen to compensate for the stolen client funds." The words hit Chad like a rapid succession of physical punches to the stomach. Every single safety net he thought he had was instantly severed. "Do not ever contact me or anyone at this firm again," Robert warned firmly. "If you step foot near this building, you will be arrested for trespassing. Goodbye, Chad. Good luck in federal prison." The call abruptly disconnected, leaving behind the monotonous, hollow sound of a dial tone. For a long, agonizing moment, Chad just stood there with the phone pressed tightly against his ear, listening to the dial tone as if it might suddenly, magically transform back into his comfortable, privileged life. But the magic was gone. The illusion was shattered. Slowly, the phone slipped from his trembling fingers. It fell to the floor, the screen shattering violently against the hard Italian marble. Chad looked down at the broken pieces of glass. Then he looked up at me. I stood perfectly still on the steps of the living room, looking directly back into his tear-filled, bloodshot eyes. I allowed a slow, deep, incredibly satisfied smile to spread across my face. It was the exact expression of a woman watching absolute poetic justice unfold in real time. This was the same man who barely 30 minutes ago had confidently strutted onto my front porch, jingled the keys to his leased BMW, and told me I needed to accept my defeat with dignity. This was the arrogant finance bro who had used his gender and his skin color to try and intimidate a self-made black woman. He had condescendingly lectured me about Georgia property law. He had threatened to have the police drag me out of my own home in handcuffs so I would not embarrass him in front of his wealthy neighbors. He truly believed he was the smartest, most superior person in the room, and now that superior man was absolutely nothing. He was unemployed, unlicensed, and completely broke. Chad's knees gave out. He did not gracefully lower himself to the floor like Veronica had. He simply collapsed. He dropped straight down onto the marble tiles like a puppet with its strings suddenly cut. He landed hard on his hands and knees right next to his shattered cell phone, staring blankly at the floor. He was completely ruined. Jade stood a few feet away, watching her husband's absolute destruction with wide, horrified eyes. She did not rush over to comfort him. She did not offer a single word of support. Jade's entire identity was tied to the fake luxury lifestyle Chad's job provided. She lived for the country club brunches, the expensive leased cars, and the designer shopping sprees. The realization that her husband was now an unemployed, disgraced criminal with frozen bank accounts hit her harder than anything else. She was looking at a future of public defenders, frozen credit cards, and absolute social humiliation. I took another slow, deliberate sip of my wine, savoring the absolute perfection of the moment. Arrogant mother-in-law was weeping on the floor next to her stolen cash. The abusive husband was a fugitive on the run, and the condescending brother-in-law had just lost his career, his money, and his freedom, all in the span of a 2-minute phone call. They had come to my house to strip me of my wealth and throw me out onto the street. Instead, they had walked directly into their own complete and utter annihilation. The federal agents were simply waiting for the local police escorts to arrive with the transport vans to haul them all away. But as I looked at the 3 broken people scattered across my beautiful foyer, I knew it was time to deliver the final, devastating blow. I walked over to the marble island, set my wine glass down with a soft clink, and reached into my designer handbag. It was time to show them why you never try to steal real estate from a woman who actually understands how the law works. My fingers brushed against the crisp folded paper resting at the very bottom of my designer handbag. I was mere seconds away from pulling it out and delivering the absolute final blow, the legal trapdoor that would swallow whatever microscopic sliver of hope they still clung to. But before I could bring the document out into the light, a sudden violent sound cracked through the heavy air of the grand foyer. It was a sharp, stinging noise that echoed loudly against the 20-foot-high ceilings, freezing me completely in place. It was not a ringing phone this time. It was the loud, unmistakable crack of flesh striking flesh. I slowly pulled my empty hand out of my bag and turned around. For a rare few seconds, the chaotic world inside my house seemed to hold perfectly still, capturing a portrait of absolute humiliation. Jade stood directly over her mother. Her right hand was raised in the air, her fingers curled slightly, her entire arm trembling violently from the force of the impact. Veronica was sprawled awkwardly sideways on the imported marble floor. Her manicured hand was clamped tightly over her left cheek. Her eyes were wide, blinking rapidly in a state of absolute, uncomprehending shock. The heavy silence in the room was deafening. Jade had just slapped her own mother across the face with everything she had. "You did this!" Jade screamed, her voice tearing through the quiet foyer like a jagged piece of glass. She did not lower her hand. She stepped closer, towering over the woman who had raised her. "You ruined my life. You ruined all of our lives." Veronica let out a pathetic, trembling gasp. She lowered her hand, revealing a bright, angry red handprint blooming across her pale skin. "Jade, how could you?" Veronica whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the ultimate betrayal. "I'm your mother. I have only ever tried to protect this family." "Protect this family?" Jade shrieked, letting out a laugh that sounded dangerously close to true madness. "You never cared about this family, Mom. You only ever cared about Darius. You worshipped him. You coddled him since the day he was born. You told him he was a genius. You told him he was a king, and you made the rest of us bow down and serve him." Jade wildly gestured toward the open Louis Vuitton suitcases, spilling stacks of stolen cash onto the floor. "You let him steal from us. You let him lie to us. And whenever he failed, whenever he screwed up, you always found a way to blame somebody else. You told us he was just misunderstood. You told us his brilliance was just too much for normal people to handle." Veronica tried to push herself up off the floor, but her arms gave out, and she slumped back down against her overturned luggage. She looked incredibly small, stripped of all the fake pearls and country club arrogance that had defined her entire existence. "Look at my husband," Jade yelled, pointing a shaking finger at Chad. Chad was still on his hands and knees in the corner, staring blankly at his shattered cell phone, completely unresponsive to the screaming match happening just 3 feet away from him. "Look at him. He's going to federal prison because he listened to your golden boy. And you told him to do it. You sat at our dining table and told Chad that Darius was smarter than all those Wall Street bankers. You told my husband to trust your son. You handed Darius the knife, and you watched him stab us in the back." Jade was hyperventilating now, tears of pure selfish rage streaming down her face, ruining her perfect, expensive makeup. The deep, festering rot of a family absolutely obsessed with appearances was finally splitting wide open for everyone to see. There was no loyalty here. There was only a desperate, clawing need to maintain an illusion of superiority, and Jade was watching her illusion burn to ashes. "We spent our entire lives pretending, Mom," Jade continued, her voice echoing shrilly. "We spent decades pretending we were wealthy, pretending we were elite, pretending we were so much better than everyone else. Pretend. Ding, we were better than her." Jade suddenly whipped around and pointed directly at me. I stood perfectly still by the marble island, my face completely expressionless, watching the spectacular implosion. "We laughed at Maya," Jade cried out, her voice breaking. "We sat in this very house drinking her wine and we mocked her for working in a warehouse. We looked down our noses at her because she came from the south side of Chicago. We treated her like she was the help. But she is the only one who actually had any real money. She is the only one who actually built something real." Veronica squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head frantically as if she could physically block out the words her daughter was screaming at her. "Please stop, Jade," Veronica sobbed. "Please just stop talking. The agents are listening." "I do not care who is listening," Jade roared, her anger completely overriding any sense of self-preservation. "Do you want to know the truth, Mom? Do you want to know how fake our entire life is? When Chad lost his job the first time, Darius did not help us. Your precious billionaire son told us to figure it out ourselves. It was Maya who paid our rent. Maya wrote the check that kept us from getting evicted from our luxury apartment, and she did it quietly so you would not find out and judge us. She funded our fake lifestyle while your son was out buying luxury watches with stolen government loans." That revelation hit Veronica like a physical blow to the chest. She looked up at me, her red, tear-stained face twisting into an expression of absolute agony. The self-made daughter-in-law she had spent 5 years relentlessly bullying and trying to destroy was the only reason her daughter had a roof over her head. The absolute shame of it was finally suffocating her. I let my gaze slowly drift across the room, taking in the full scope of the wreckage. The camera of my mind captured every single pathetic detail. I looked at Chad, the arrogant white finance bro who had utilized his privilege to try and intimidate me, now completely broken, unemployed, and facing a massive federal indictment. I looked at Jade, the entitled, lazy sister-in-law who had built her entire identity on being superior to me, now screaming like a feral animal, completely terrified of losing her designer bags and her country club membership. And finally, I looked at Veronica, the cruel, manipulative matriarch who had orchestrated years of emotional abuse, now sitting on the floor with a red handprint on her face, realizing her beloved son had used her as a human shield. They were tearing each other apart. The FBI agents did not even have to interrogate them. Agent Vance and his team simply stood near the front door watching in absolute silence, as the family aggressively confessed to every single toxic, manipulative, and illegal thing they had ever done. The pristine, wealthy suburban image they had spent decades carefully cultivating was completely gone, replaced by the ugly, undeniable reality of their absolute greed. "You pushed me to marry a man in finance so I could be rich," Jade sobbed, her energy finally starting to drain, leaving behind a hollow, terrified shell of a woman. "You pushed me to care about nothing but money and status, but you let Darius do whatever he wanted. You let him destroy us. You are the reason we are standing in the middle of a federal raid. I hate you. I absolutely hate you." Jade turned her back on her mother, wrapping her arms tightly around her own stomach as she wept bitterly. Veronica reached out a trembling hand toward her daughter's back. "Jade, please," Veronica begged, her voice a weak, raspy whisper. "I am your mother. We are family. We have to stick together." Jade slowly turned her head and looked over her shoulder at the woman crying on the floor. Her eyes were completely cold and devoid of any affection. "Darius was your only child," Jade stated flatly, delivering a blow that was far more devastating than the physical slap. "Chad and I were just the audience you kept around to applaud for him. Well, the show is over, Mom. I hope you enjoy the finale." The absolute finality in Jade's voice signaled the complete death of their family dynamic. There was nothing left to say. There was no coming back from this. The bridges were not just burned, they were completely obliterated. Agent Vance finally stepped forward, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over the room. He looked at the three broken people with an expression of intense professional exhaustion. "Are you quite finished?" Agent Vance asked, his voice cutting through the remaining tension. "Because the local authorities have just pulled up to the security gate. Transport vans are currently making their way up the driveway. We have a significant amount of processing to do downtown, and I would like to get these suitcases into a secure evidence locker as soon as possible." Veronica let out a fresh wave of panicked sobs at the mentee. On of the transport vans, Chad finally looked up from his shattered phone, his face completely pale and hollowed out. Jade just stared blankly at the wall, completely numb to the reality of her impending arrest. It was over. The federal government had them exactly where they wanted them. But as Agent Vance reached for his radio to clear the local police to enter the property, I cleared my throat. The sound was soft, but in that quiet room, it immediately drew everyone's attention. Agent Vance looked over at me, raising a questioning eyebrow. "I am afraid there is one minor logistical detail we need to clear up before you take them away," I said smoothly. I reached back into my designer handbag. My fingers found the crisp manila envelope I had been trying to retrieve before Jade's dramatic outburst. I pulled the envelope out, unclasped the metal fastener, and slid out a heavy piece of legal parchment with a shining gold notary seal stamped clearly at the bottom. I held it in my hand, feeling the absolute weight of the power it contained. Veronica, Jade, and Chad all slowly turned their heads to look at me. Even in their state of total despair, they could sense that I was about to deliver the ultimate killing stroke. "You see," I continued, stepping out from behind the kitchen island and walking slowly toward the center of the foyer. "I told you that Darius won this $4 million house in the divorce settlement this morning. And I told you that he legally owns it, which means the federal government has every right to seize it, lock the doors, and eventually auction it off to cover his stolen loans." I stopped right in front of Agent Vance and held the document out toward him. "But there is a very specific detail about this property that Darius completely overlooked when he was planning his brilliant escape," I said, a dangerous, triumphant smile spreading across my face. "And it is a detail that is going to make seizing this house a lot more complicated than you think." Before I could hand the notarized parchment over to Agent Vance, a sound pierced through the heavy silence of the grand foyer. It started as a faint, distant wail, but within seconds it multiplied and grew into a deafening chorus of approaching sirens. The local authorities were no longer just at the security gate. They were speeding up my private, winding driveway. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows flanking my front door, the serene afternoon sunlight was suddenly violently invaded by flashing red and blue lights. The strobe effect bounced off the crystal chandelier, casting frantic, colorful shadows across the imported Italian marble. The heavy thudding sound of car doors slamming shut echoed from the front lawn, followed by the muffled static of police radios. The abstract concept of a federal investigation was over. The terrifying physical reality of immediate incarceration had officially arrived. Veronica saw the flashing lights sweeping across the walls, and something inside her completely snapped. The last remaining thread of her sanity simply unraveled. She realized with absolute certainty that she was not going back to her comfortable suburban home tonight. She was not going to sleep in her plush bed. She was going to be fingerprinted, photographed, and locked inside a concrete holding cell. A guttural, animalistic sound tore from Veronica's throat. She did not try to stand up. She did not try to regain her composure. Instead, she scrambled across the marble floor on her hands and knees. She moved with a frantic, blind desperation, crawling directly past the open Louis Vuitton suitcases and the stacks of stolen cash. She lunged forward, throwing her arms out, and clamped her trembling hands tightly around the fabric of my custom designer dress. "Maya, please." Veronica shrieked, her voice completely raw and broken. I looked down at her. From her position on the floor looking up at me, I was no longer the unworthy daughter-in-law from the south side of Chicago. I was the absolute, undisputed authority in the room. I held all the cards, all the money, and all the power. The camera of my memory captured the perfect low-angle shot of this moment, cementing me as an untouchable force, while the woman who had tormented me for 5 years groveled at my feet. "You have to help me," Veronica begged, her tears soaking into the hem of my dress. Her perfectly styled hair was a tangled mess. Her mascara was running down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks. "I cannot go to jail, Maya. I am an old woman. I have high blood pressure. I have a heart condition. I will not survive in a place like that." I did not move. I stood perfectly rigid, my face an impenetrable mask of absolute ice. I let her weep. I let her feel the full crushing weight of her own helplessness. "You have millions of dollars," Veronica cried, her fingers digging desperately into the silk fabric of my skirt. "You have your company. You have lawyers. Please, Maya, you can pay our bail. You can hire a defense team to get us out of this. You can tell these agents that we made a mistake, that we did not know what Darius was doing. They will listen to you. You are a respected business owner. You have to save us." Veronica pressed her forehead against my knees, sobbing uncontrollably. "We are family, Maya," she wailed, playing the ultimate, most hypocritical card she could possibly conjure. "I know we had our disagreements. I know I was hard on you sometimes, but you loved my son once. You took vows. We were your family for 5 years. Please look into your heart and forgive us. Do not let them take me away in handcuffs. I am begging you." The silence in the room returned, broken only by Veronica's pathetic sobbing and the heavy footsteps of local police officers walking up my front steps. Agent Vance stood nearby, his arms crossed over his chest, simply watching the spectacle unfold. He made no move to pull her off me. He was giving me the floor. I slowly looked away from the flashing police lights outside and focused my gaze entirely on the top of Veronica's head. I felt the sweat and tears from her face seeping through the fabric of my dress. It was absolutely disgusting. I took one slow, deliberate step backward. The sudden movement yanked the silk fabric completely out of Veronica's desperate grip. She let out a sharp gasp, falling forward slightly, her hands slapping against the cold marble floor. I looked down at my dress calmly, using my free hand to brush away the wrinkles she had caused. I smoothed the fabric with slow, meticulous precision, treating her emotional breakdown as nothing more than a minor annoyance. Then I looked back down into her terrified, pleading eyes. "Family," I repeated, my voice perfectly quiet yet carrying the sharp, lethal edge of a razor blade. "You want to talk to me about family right now, Veronica?" Veronica nodded frantically, looking up at me with wide, bloodshot eyes. "Yes, we are family." I let out a short, completely humorless laugh. My gaze swept over to Jade, who was curled up against the wall, and Chad, who was still staring blankly at his broken phone. "When I was working 80-hour weeks to build my logistics company from the ground up," I began, my tone measured and completely devoid of mercy, "you sat at your country club and told your friends that I was a neglectful wife. You told them I was selfish for prioritizing my career over giving you grandchildren." Veronica opened her mouth to speak, but I instantly cut her off. "When I paid entirely out of my own pocket to send you and Darius's father on a luxury anniversary cruise to the Bahamas, you complained to the entire extended family that the cabin I booked was too small," I continued, taking another slow step backward to put even more distance between us. "You never saw me as a daughter, Veronica. You never saw me as family. You saw me as an ATM." You saw me as a convenient bank account to fund the lifestyle your genius son was completely incapable of providing. Maya, that is not true, Veronica sobbed, reaching a hand out toward me again. Do not touch me, I snapped, my voice finally rising just enough to echo off the high ceilings. Veronica flinched violently, pulling her hand back as if I had burned her. You loved my money, I said, staring directly into her soul. But you hated the fact that the money came from a black woman who grew up in a neighborhood you were too terrified to even drive through. You hated that I did not need your son. So you spent 5 years trying to tear down my confidence, belittling my achievements, and making me feel like I should be grateful that your family even allowed me to sit at the table. I paused, letting my words sink in. The local police officers had reached the front porch. I could hear them speaking quietly with the FBI agent stationed outside the door. Time was up. And the absolute second you thought the ATM was broken, I whispered, my voice dropping back to a lethal calm. The absolute second you thought Darius had legally stolen my home and left me with nothing, you drove over here to throw me out onto the street. You stood on my front porch, laughed in my face, and told me to pack my cheap bags. Veronica squeezed her eyes shut, fresh tears pouring down her face. She had absolutely no defense. Every single word I said was the undeniable truth. You are a grown woman, Veronica, I stated coldly. Jade is a grown woman. Chad is a licensed financial fiduciary. You all made your own choices. Chad chose to steal from his clients. Jade chose to cheer him on and demand a bigger house. And you chose to load 8 suitcases full of stolen federal cash into a car to protect a coward who abandoned you the second he heard a badge over the phone. I took a deep breath, standing perfectly tall, a self-made queen, entirely untethered from their toxic web. I am not spending a single dime of my hard-earned money to post bail for the people who came here to destroy me, I declared, my voice ringing with absolute finality. I am not hiring lawyers for you. I am not writing a character reference for you. When you get to the county jail tonight, Veronica, I highly suggest you ask to use the public defender, because I am officially cutting you off. Veronica's head dropped to the floor. She let out a long, agonizing wail, a sound of pure, unadulterated despair. She finally realized that the bridge was completely burned. There was no manipulation left to try. There was no guilt trip that would work. She was entirely on her own. The heavy double doors of my front entrance suddenly swung open. 4 uniformed local police officers stepped into the grand foyer, their duty belts jingling loudly. They took one look at the massive pile of seized cash, the weeping woman on the floor, the catatonic man in the corner, and the FBI agent standing watch. Agent Vance nodded to the lead officer. They are all yours, Vance said flatly. Warrants have been executed. The charges are felony conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and possession of stolen federal assets. You can begin the transport process. The officers immediately moved forward, pulling heavy metal handcuffs from their belts. Wait, I said loudly, raising my hand and stepping forward. The local officers paused, looking at Agent Vance, who then looked directly at me. Veronica slowly lifted her head, a sudden, pathetic glimmer of hope flashing in her swollen eyes. She thought I was changing my mind. She thought I was going to intervene and stop the arrest. But I was not stopping the arrest. I was simply making sure the federal government understood exactly what they had seized today. I turned my attention back to Agent Vance, holding up the notarized legal document I had pulled from my bag just moments before Veronica's breakdown. As I was saying before I was so rudely interrupted, I said smoothly, ensuring everyone in the room was listening. I completely agree that this house belongs to Darius, and I completely agree that the federal government has the absolute legal right to seize this $4 million structure to cover his debts. I took 2 steps toward Agent Vance and held the document out. He looked at it suspiciously, then slowly reached out and took the heavy parchment from my hand. However, I continued, my smile returning sharper and more vicious than ever. If you read the property lines carefully, you will notice a massive discrepancy between the deed to the house and the deed to the land it was built on. Agent Vance frowned, his eyes dropping to the heavy parchment in his hands. He was a seasoned federal investigator who had spent his entire career untangling complex financial crimes and corporate fraud. He had seen every trick, every hidden offshore account, and every forged signature in the book. But as his eyes scanned the dense legal paragraphs and the shining gold notary seal, his stoic expression began to crack. A look of absolute disbelief, rapidly followed by a profound sense of professional respect, washed over his face. He looked up from the document and stared at me. "You carved out the land," Agent Vance stated, his voice hushed with genuine astonishment. I gave him a slow, incredibly satisfied nod. Veronica, Jade, and Chad looked back and forth between us, completely confused. The legal terminology was flying right over their heads, blinded as they were by their own arrogance. But I was more than happy to break it down for them into very simple, easily digestible pieces. "You see, Veronica," I said, projecting my voice so every single person in the grand foyer could hear me clearly. "When I bought this property 5 years ago, before I ever made the terrible mistake of marrying your son, I did not just sign my name on a dotted line. I purchased the entire 5-acre plot of land through a private limited liability company. It was a heavily protected premarital asset." I began to pace slowly across the marble floor, my heels clicking sharply, commanding the absolute attention of the room. "When Darius and I got married, we built this beautiful $4 million structure together because we used joint funds to build it. The house itself was legally considered marital property. That is why Darius fought so hard for it in the divorce. He saw the massive square footage. He saw the imported Italian marble, and his greed completely blinded him to the fine print." I paused, pointing a perfectly manicured finger directly at the ground beneath my feet. "When I instructed my lawyers to surrender the property this morning, I was very, very specific," I explained, my voice practically humming with triumph. "I transferred 100% of the deed for the physical structure to Darius. I gave him the bricks, the glass, the wood, and the roof, but I never transferred the deed to the dirt it sits on." Chad let out a sharp, ragged gasp from his corner of the room. He was a disgraced finance manager, but he still understood the lethal mechanics of real estate law. His bloodshot eyes widened in absolute horror as the reality of what I had done finally hit him. "She owns the land," Chad whispered, his voice trembling so badly he could barely form the words. He looked at Veronica, who was staring blankly at him. "Darius only owns the house. The house is completely landlocked." "Exactly," I said, giving Chad a bright, completely merciless smile. "Darius legally owns this beautiful mansion, and the federal government has every right to seize it. But the 5 acres of land surrounding it in every single direction belongs exclusively to me." I turned my attention back to Agent Vance, who was now fighting a very subtle, highly amused smile. "And more importantly," I continued, gesturing toward the massive floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the front lawn, "my LLC also owns the private half-mile-long driveway that connects this house to the public street. Which means, Agent Vance, while you have the absolute right to seize this house, you and your agents are currently trespassing on my private land to get to it." Agent Vance chuckled. It was a low, genuine sound of appreciation. "That is a very impressive legal maneuver, Maya," he admitted freely. "We can seize the structure and we can put it up for federal auction to try and recoup the stolen government funds. But whoever buys this mansion will not have the legal right to drive up the driveway, park their car, or even walk across the front lawn without your explicit permission." "That is entirely correct," I replied smoothly, "and I charge a very, very high toll for access." Veronica's jaw dropped open. She looked around the grand foyer, her eyes scanning the luxurious walls and the sparkling chandelier. The beautiful castle her son had promised her was nothing but a useless, hollow shell. It was a prison made of expensive glass and marble, entirely surrounded by an impenetrable fortress of my legal ownership. But I was not quite finished. I had promised them a finale, and I always deliver on my promises. "Now, keeping 5 acres of manicured lawns in a prestigious neighborhood is very expensive," I said, walking back over to my designer handbag. "I am a businesswoman. I do not like to leave my assets sitting idle. I like my properties to generate steady, reliable revenue. Since I no longer have to worry about living in this house, I decided to rezone my land for commercial use." Jade stopped crying. She looked at me, a new wave of terror washing over her face. "What did you do?" she asked, her voice a fragile, terrified whisper. I reached into my bag and pulled out a second document. This one was a thick, bound commercial contract. "I signed a 20-year lease agreement yesterday afternoon," I announced, proudly holding the contract up for them to see. "I lease the exclusive usage rights for the entire 5 acres of land surrounding this house to a massive, highly profitable industrial waste processing company." The absolute silence that fell over the grand foyer was heavier than concrete. "Starting tomorrow morning at 6:00, I explained cheerfully. "Fleets of heavy yellow bulldozers and commercial dump trucks are going to roll up my driveway. They are going to tear up the custom rose gardens. They are going to pave over the heated swimming pool. And they are going to begin dumping hundreds of tons of commercial garbage directly onto the front lawn." Veronica let out a low, whimpering moan, burying her face in her hands. "Darius thought he pulled off the greatest heist of his life," I said, my voice ringing with absolute, undeniable victory. "He thought he stole a $4 million luxury estate. But what he actually got was a massive federal indictment attached to a worthless, landlocked building sitting directly in the middle of a literal landfill. And the best part is, he still owes the federal government the full amount of his fraudulent loans. He is going to spend the next 10 years in federal prison entirely bankrupt, while I collect a massive monthly rent check from the garbage dump sitting on his front porch." I looked down at Veronica, Jade, and Chad. They were completely and utterly destroyed. There was no arrogance left. There were no more threats about the local police or the homeowners association. They had been completely buried alive by their own blinding greed. The local police officers stepped forward, their handcuffs clinking loudly in the quiet room. Agent Vance handed my legal document back to me with a respectful nod. Then he turned to the officers and pointed directly at the 3 broken people scattered across my marble floor. "Take them away," Agent Vance ordered. Veronica did not fight as the cold metal cuffs were slapped around her wrists. She simply sobbed quietly, a broken, defeated old woman being dragged out of the house she had tried to steal. Jade wailed hysterically as the officers pulled her to her feet, screaming about her ruined life. As they marched her toward the flashing lights outside, and Chad walked out in absolute catatonic silence, his head hanging down in pure shame, knowing his career and his freedom were gone forever. I stood in the center of my grand foyer, taking a slow, deep breath of the cool Georgia air. The house was empty. The parasites were gone. The garbage had finally been taken out. The sharp metallic ratcheting of the handcuffs echoed through the grand foyer, striking a completely different chord than the cheerful ringtone that had sealed their fate moments earlier. It was the heavy, undeniable sound of absolute consequences. I picked up my glass of Cabernet from the kitchen island, holding it up to the light. As I looked through the curved crystal and the deep ruby liquid, the chaotic scene unfolding in my house warped into a beautifully distorted painting of poetic justice. Through the blurred lens of the wine glass, I watched the silver metal bite down. The heavy silver rings clamped tightly over the expensive fabric of Veronica's floral pantsuit, forming a perfect, inescapable figure eight around her wrists. She did not fight the officers. All the arrogant, upper-middle-class authority she had wielded like a weapon her entire life had been completely drained out of her. She was nothing but a tired, terrified accessory to a massive federal crime. She kept her head bowed, her shoulders shaking with silent, pathetic sobs as the officer read her Miranda rights, listing off obstruction of justice and asset concealment like a terrifying grocery list. Jade, however, was not going quietly. The sheer humiliation of being physically restrained sent her into a blind panic. As the officer grabbed her wrists, she twisted her shoulders violently, screaming at the top of her lungs about her social media reputation, her innocent children, and how she was going to sue the entire police department. The officer simply ignored her shrieks, expertly pinning her arms behind her back. The second silver figure eight snapped shut, locking her firmly in place. Her designer handbag, the one she had proudly strutted into my house with, was left completely abandoned on the floor next to the seized federal cash. Then came Chad, the arrogant, condescending finance bro who had stood on my porch and threatened me with these exact same police officers. He offered absolutely no resistance. He held his hands out behind his back voluntarily, his eyes completely hollow and dead. He moved like a prisoner who had already been locked in a cell for decades. Metal snapped around his wrists, officially finalizing his complete ruin. The officers gripped them by their upper arms and began the humiliating march toward the front entrance. The heavy double doors were already propped wide open, letting the humid Georgia heat and the blinding glare of the police lights spill into the foyer. I followed them at a slow, leisurely pace. My bare feet moved silently across the cool marble until I stepped out onto the warm, sunlit concrete of my expansive front porch. The scene outside was an absolute masterpiece of public humiliation. The flashing red and blue lights of the 4 police cruisers had drawn a massive audience. This was a highly exclusive, heavily gated community where people paid millions of dollars for privacy and prestige. And now, the very neighbors Chad had been so terrified of offending were standing on their perfectly manicured lawns, watching the spectacle unfold. I saw the Homeowners Association president standing 2 doors down, his jaw dropped in absolute shock. A group of women from the local country club, women Veronica had desperately tried to impress for years, had stopped their evening walk. They were standing on the sidewalk with their smartphones held high, recording every single second of Veronica, Jade, and Chad being paraded out of my house in silver handcuffs. The officers guided them carefully down the brick steps. Jade tried to hide her face behind her shoulder, weeping hysterically as the camera flashes caught her. Veronica kept her eyes glued to the pavement, completely broken by the public shame. But as Chad reached the bottom step, he stumbled slightly. He stopped walking and heavily turned his head, looking back up at me one final time. I stood at the absolute top of the stairs, perfectly framed by the grand mahogany doors of the $4 million estate he had tried to steal from me. The afternoon sun caught the crystal of my wine glass, making the red liquid glow like a ruby. I looked down at him, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace. I raised my glass high in the air, offering him a toast. "Chad," I called out. My voice was smooth, carrying effortlessly across the lawn, loud enough for the country club members and the HOA president to hear every single word. He stared up at me, his face pale and twisted with a mixture of hatred and absolute despair. I offered him a perfectly sweet, completely venomous smile. "Try to keep your head down, Chad. You really do not want to make a scene in a prestigious neighborhood like this. The neighbors across the street are already looking, and frankly, it just looks incredibly ugly." The look of absolute soul-crushing defeat that washed over his face was the greatest vintage I had ever tasted. He closed his eyes, unable to look at me for a second longer. The police officer placed a heavy, unforgiving hand on the back of Chad's neck, forcing him to duck his head, and shoved him forcefully into the back of the waiting squad car. The heavy door slammed shut behind him, sealing his fate with a resounding metallic thud. 6 months have passed since that spectacular afternoon on my front porch. The heavy, suffocating clouds that had hung over my life for 5 long years have completely cleared, replaced by a brilliant, warm, and unending sunlight. I am currently sitting in the living room of my new luxury penthouse, looking out through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows at a panoramic view of the city skyline. There is no one here to belittle me. There is no one here to drain my bank accounts. There is only peace. The justice system moved with an incredibly satisfying speed. Darius, the brilliant visionary, did not even make it across the Texas border. Federal marshals tracked his burner phone and pulled him out of a cheap, roach-infested motel room in El Paso just 3 days after he abandoned his family. He stood in a federal courtroom, stripped of his tailored suits and his arrogant smirk, wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. The judge showed absolutely no mercy. Darius was sentenced to 10 straight years in federal prison for wire fraud and money laundering. He has absolutely no assets left. And when he finally gets out, he will be a middle-aged felon with a massive mountain of government debt hanging over his head. Chad's life unraveled with breathtaking speed. The intense pressure of the federal indictment, combined with the sudden, terrifying reality of being completely broke, destroyed whatever fragile foundation his marriage was built on. Chad officially filed for divorce from Jade just 2 months after the raid, desperately trying to distance himself from the Tinsley family name. He managed to avoid jail time by fully cooperating with the FBI and testifying against Darius, but his punishment was still severe. His professional license was permanently revoked. The arrogant white finance manager who loved to aggressively lecture me about wealth is now working as a waiter at a mid-tier chain restaurant downtown. He spends his days taking drink orders and wiping down sticky tables, forced to serve the exact same demographic of people he used to look down upon. Jade is drowning in her own reality. Without Chad's income or my secret financial support, she was evicted from her luxury apartment. She had to sell every single one of her designer bags and her expensive jewelry just to pay her mounting legal fees. Her days of pretending to be a wealthy social media influencer are completely over. But Veronica's downfall was perhaps the most poetic of all. The federal government seized all the illicit cash she tried to smuggle, leaving her absolutely penniless. She lost her comfortable suburban home and was forced to move into a rundown, subsidized social housing complex on the outskirts of the city. The woman who used to wear expensive floral pantsuits and sneer at my Southside Chicago upbringing now lives in a cramped, poorly ventilated apartment that smells permanently of old cigarettes and boiled cabbage. But the absolute worst part for Veronica was the social exile. Her beloved church community, the very people she used to brag to every single Sunday, completely excommunicated her. When the news of the federal raid and the stolen money became public, she became an absolute pariah. When she walks down the street, the women she used to gossip with now cross to the other side to avoid making eye contact. As for the $4 million mansion, the federal government still technically owns the structure. But just as I promised, the heavy yellow bulldozers rolled in. My industrial waste processing tenants are making excellent use of my 5 acres of land. Darius' dream home now sits completely abandoned, surrounded by towering mountains of commercial garbage and the constant, deafening roar of heavy machinery. I collect a massive 6-figure rent check from the waste company every single month, and I do not even have to look at the property. I did not just stop at securing my real estate. Last month, I officially finalized the sale of my medical logistics company to a massive national conglomerate. I walked away from the closing table with a wire transfer for $25 million. I am 34 years old, completely self-made, and financially free for the rest of my life. I spend my mornings drinking expensive coffee, managing my investment portfolio, and funding a new legal aid charity I started specifically for women. Dealing with financial abuse. Veronica, Jade, and Chad always thought that a divorce paper was the ultimate defeat. They thought taking away my marriage meant taking away my worth. They thought a divorce paper was the end of a woman, but really, it was just a permit for me to finally clean out the trash. Have you ever had to clean toxic trash out of your own life? Let me know your story in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe to this channel if you believe that the best revenge is simply massive, undeniable success. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, never let anyone make you feel like a guest in the empire you built with your own 2 hands.